Good afternoon, and welcome to the Council of American Ambassadors Roundtable event with Ambassador Adrian Zuckerman, recently returned as the U.S. Ambassador to Romania. I'm Kathleen Sheehan, the Executive Director of the Council. I just want to make two housekeeping notes. First, we're going to be recording today's conversation. And second, we strongly encourage questions from the audience. Just submit a question. All you have to do is use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And with that, I'm very pleased to turn the floor over to Council Member Ambassador Jim Rosapep, himself a former U.S. Ambassador to Romania. So Ambassador Rosapep, it's all yours.
Thanks a lot, Kathleen. Adrian, thanks for joining us today. And thanks to all the CA members who are with us. I had never met Adrian until he was nominated by President Trump to be ambassador to Romania. And so, of course, I read up on him and then we got together. And the many things that I learned about his background that are very relevant to his service for our country, one of which is he's a very distinguished real estate lawyer, long career in real estate law in New York, graduate of MIT, undergraduate, graduate of New York Law School, and he was born in Romania. He is only the second U.S. ambassador to Romania of Romanian heritage and the first one who was born there and speaks the language. I assure you, I tried to learn, but we're not going to give a test on that today, Ambassador Zuckerman. Obviously, that gave him the kinds of insights into the country in which he would represent the United States that most of us don't have, frankly. So we're going to talk about a lot of things today, but I want to start off by asking Adrian, I think you were only back in Romania once after you left with your family at about age 9 or 10. Before you came back as ambassador. When you came back so many years later to Romania, the place where you were born and were a child, what had changed and what hadn't changed?
Before I answer your question, sure. Jim, Ambassador Rosapep, and I always have a problem mispronouncing your last name, so I apologize in advance for that. But just a quick note of thanks. First of all, I have to thank Jim, as I mentioned to him a few minutes ago. After I was nominated, he was incredibly gracious to me, and we had dinner in Washington, and we discussed his time in Romania and his brilliant book about his time in Romania and his travels through Romania while ambassador, and subsequently. And for those of you who haven't read it, you really should. It's just a tremendous book. And thank you for dinner, Jim. I still owe you a dinner, I think. Secondly, I want to thank Kathleen Sheehan and Jocelyn Young for putting the program together tonight. They're absolutely terrific. So thank you for your hard work in organizing this. I left Romania when I was 9, and we lived in Italy for 8 or 9 months, in Rome, principally, before we went to the United States. I grew up in New Haven, and I didn't come back to Romania until about, I don't know, 12 years ago, give or take. And there were a lot of changes. It was a tremendous amount of changes. I was only here then for about 10 days, 2 weeks with my daughter. And your recollections of things when you're 9 as compared to your recollection of things when you're 39, as I am now, just kidding, I wish, are quite different. But one of the things which I have to bore all of you with is one of the first things I did when I came back as ambassador was look for the house where I grew up. And I keep a picture on my desk, and I don't know if you could see this, but
yes,
the top 2 rooms up here, my family and I grew up in 2 rooms, only cold water. That's my daughter with me when she was here last January. And you had to heat with firewood that you kept in the basement, carry upstairs. and use terracotta stoves. Jim, I'm sure you're familiar with them, having been here. Most people in the States or that have not seen Eastern Europe, not Romania specifically, but this was typical for most of the Eastern European countries, have no idea what that means. But there's still areas of Romania that heat their houses that way. And Romania and a lot of the other Eastern European countries are still in a state of flux, growth, and it's really a tale of two cities where you have very technologically advanced areas, financially advanced areas, and you have very rural or mountainous areas that are the other extreme of the socioeconomic scale. So there's a lot of work and growth that has to take place here to elevate the standard of living, as you well know, Jim, because you've seen it on your travels through the country. So that was a long way of answering your question. I apologize for taking so long.
No, having a picture of where you lived as a kid, that's above and beyond the Call of Duty. I think that maybe the first guest on this series who showed us the picture of where they were a kid. So I think it's terrific and really very interesting. Let's switch over to more or less today in the last year or so in the COVID crisis. It's been a worldwide crisis, but it's played out in different ways in different places. So you were there obviously all last year during the COVID crisis. You're back now, both back in the United States and now today, literally back in Romania. So can you kind of fill us in on how the crisis, both health-wise and economically, has played out in Romania?
It's very interesting. And let me just start out by saying, in many ways, Romania is very similar to the Northeast of the United States. Climate-wise, many socially, I think there are a lot of Romanian people in New York and the greater New York area, Washington. There were also a lot of Romanians in Chicago and LA, but I think it's very much resembles the Northeast of the United States. I was here before COVID started, and things shut down more or less the middle of March of last year. And I remember that because I was in the United States. And I flew back and I got here, I think, on a Wednesday, and I had tickets to the opera to see Rigoletto. And the next day, everything got shut down. And I remember being very disappointed. They have an extremely wonderful opera in Bucharest. Very talented group of performers. And after that, I think Romania, like the United States, like the rest of Europe, struggled with what the best way to contain and deal with this scourge was. I think they thought they had it under control. I think it grew out of control from being very limited. Everybody thought it was going to be short-lived, and it was not. We had a second and third wave. One of the issues of big concern for Romania was the limited capacity of its health system, which made some of the government reactions perhaps a little harsher than they would have been in other countries, but they had limited hospital beds, limited professionals, medical doctors and nurses, and like the United States, they struggled having the personal protective equipment in sufficient numbers. They didn't have masks. They didn't have the protective garments. They did not have sufficient oxygen. Nobody in the world was prepared for this, but to the Romanians' credit, and I have to give them a lot of credit because I believe they responded superbly. They developed resources within the country to produce masks and protective equipment. They created oxygen. We helped them bring in protective equipment from South Korea. The U.S. Air Force, the heavy lift wing, contributed, I don't know, something on the order of $1 million to arrange for some flights over, loaded with protective equipment. And similar to the U.S., the Romanians ordered various industries to start producing ventilators and stockpiling oxygen and building and manufacturing protective equipment. So their response was tremendous, very responsive, and I think they handled it about as well as any Western country handled this nightmare. The other thing which I have to mention, and I'm very proud of the Romanians, they sent a flight of about 15 or so doctors and toxicologists to Alabama to assist U.S. victims and to also go around with the Alabama National Guard to learn, see how they're dealing with these issues and to show the Guard how they had been dealing with these issues in Romania and Moldova. I know my friend Lindy Blanchard's on the call. So Lindy, if you're on, how are you? Lindy's from Alabama, and I hope she's the next senator from Alabama. So we're behind you, Lindy.
For those who aren't as familiar with Eastern Europe and American relations, during the Bush 1 administration, it's been continued all the way since, the U.S. government has partnered state national guards with the militaries in Eastern Europe. And Alabama is partnered with the Romanian military, which is there are lots of folks from Alabama and Romania going back and forth. And it's good to hear that. I'm sure they were very proud to come over and try to help us. Everybody needed help. So.
Yeah, the Romanians did a great job. The defense minister, Ciucă, is tremendous. The Chad, Petrescu, tremendous. They are very high level of sophistication, and they really care about the United States. They know how much the United States cares about Romania. They've committed, in essence, to have the United States be a core pillar of their defense and future strategy. And to me, they were just tremendous. The U.S. has no better friend in these parts than Romania. It's just a tremendous relationship.
Let me suggest members start posting questions that you have, and we'll ask them as they come along. I ask two more questions related to COVID and then move over to strategic issues and foreign policy issues. To what extent was Romania helped or hurt or not affected in the COVID crisis by being in the European Union? Because the European Union was doing certain things and individual countries could do certain things. Was that very relevant, the fact that they were in the Union, good, bad, or ugly?
You know, that's really an excellent question. And I wish my memory was better because the issues at the beginning, I don't know how deliberate they were, but I think each country was struggling to figure out what was best for that particular country. And there were some countries where the pandemic was worse than others. Some were under lockdown, and while others had virtually zero infection rates. So it went from 0 to 100% in lockdown in other countries and everything in between. So it was difficult to coordinate and have a unified strategy when you had those kinds of facts on the ground. Unfortunately, once you had this so-called second wave hit, everybody seemed to suffer. And I think the Europeans, for the most part, all got on the same page with similar, if not exact type of restraints, responses, trying to control the scourge. I mean, it was just a horrific year and a half, which turned the European economy upside down. It turned the U.S. economy upside down. But I think we're all more resilient than the Chinese think. And the Wuhan virus, I think, will be proven to have come out of Wuhan. And my guess is it probably wasn't accidental, but who knows? We'll see.
One last question on COVID, and then I'm going to take a question from Ambassador Harris. So bring us up to today. You're in Bucharest literally this evening. What is the situation in Romania today with vaccinations and the economy, and compare it to the United States, because you're back and forth now a lot?
Romania is, frankly, it's doing great. It's got the highest growth rate in the EU. I think they're up near 6-7% again, which is tremendous. They survived last year, and I have to say this, the Prime Minister Kitsu was the finance minister last year. And I think the Romanians really struggled to get the cash flow to keep the economy running, to keep people eating, and with all the different shutdowns, and notwithstanding the tremendous borrowing and the financial, I was going to say manipulations, but that's the wrong word, but the financial restructuring and borrowing that was happening, they managed to keep Romania's credit rating intact, which a lot of people did not think was possible, which was a great feat, because had the credit rating gone down, interest rates would have gone up, and it would crater the economy. Against this backdrop, they were left with some very onerous pension increases that the prior PSD government left them, which they managed to get beyond. And I think a tremendous amount of credit needs to go to the current Prime Minister for his work as the finance minister over the last year during the height of the COVID crisis here.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to read Ambassador Harris's question. Adrian, Harry Harris here. Good seeing you, and congrats on a fab tour in Romania. I wonder if you'd like to talk briefly about the Aegis Ashore site in Devitoglu. He has a second question that I'll come back to after you answer that one.
Harry, it's great to have Rosa Pep read your question. I hope you guys are doing well. Kudos on your great service over the last year or so, year and a half, however long it's been. Aegis Ashore is an anti-ballistic missile system located at a place called Divest, and it protects not just Romania. It protects most of, let's just say, Eastern Europe. There may be some enhancements in the works. I won't get into that. But contrary to what Chinese, Russian, and other propaganda say, it's not an offensive weapon. It's solely a defensive weapon that's basically knocks down missiles that are aimed at Europe, and mostly from the Middle East area, and Iran and that area of the world. But I also have to point out, if I may, Harry, with your indulgence, and Harry asked me about that because it's called the Aegis Ashore, because it's basically the deck house off a Navy ship, and Harry had a long and distinguished career as the commander of the Pacific Fleet. So he probably knows more about Aegis Ashore than I will ever know. But over the last year, which is frankly rewarding to me, given what's been going on over the last 2-3 months, the U.S. has brought in a tremendous amount of high-tech military equipment to Romania, state-of-the-art Patriots, HIMARS, which for those of you who don't know what it is, they're high mobility artillery rocket shells, coastal strike missiles, various helicopters, and other weapons to make Romania, or give Romania the ability to be a credible defense force against any sort of Russian incursion or other incursion on its borders, and for that matter, the borders of Eastern Europe. Where we are today, we have Poland and Romania as the eastern flank of the European Union, and Europe putting up a wall against Russian aggression. And the U.S. is heavily supporting both countries in that aspect, as well they should be. And Romania and Poland are about as close now as they've ever been in that defensive posture. Harry, I'm sorry I strayed beyond your initial question, so I hope you indulge me.
Well, now we'll take a second question, which you touched on. It's a great transition. So what are the Chinese up to in Romania?
I'm sorry, what's what?
What are the Chinese up to in Romania?
You know, the Chinese are up to no good, not just in Romania, but around the world. I think my friend Keith Kroc had it right, trying to set up the clean pathways and clean networks, and setting forth the danger of Chinese companies, which are basically owned and controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. The disinformation coming out of China is tremendous. The disinformation coming out of Russia is tremendous. I don't think people realize how bad it is. I think they've been pushing very hard against the Romanians passing a 5G law. That law is about to pass. The government has approved it. One house of parliament, it's a bicameral parliament here. One house has approved it. The other one will approve it shortly, and it'll be signed into law, which will basically preclude Chinese involvement on national security basis in the 5G world, which is a law that we pushed heavily last year, and basically has been bogged down in the parliamentary system here due to the tremendous tens of millions of dollars in spending by the Chinese opposing it, but it's going to pass anyway. The Chinese were brought in here, oh, I don't know, I guess they were here during the communist years. They have a number of businesses here. one of the things where we were successful last year, we were able to convince the Romanians to terminate their contract to build and renovate the Cernavoda nuclear plant. So they're out of there, which I think was a big blow. We have two great American companies leading that project, which is a great success for the United States. We have Exxon providing, U.S. Exxon providing financing up to $7 billion of that project. And I think that's a great success story for the United States. And a big defeat for the Chinese here, which they stung from. However, they still have the Confucius schools here. They still have a big propaganda machine. They're still pushing to try to build infrastructure. It's an incredibly volatile and dangerous situation with the Chinese.
We have a question from Ambassador April Foley, which I'm going to come to in a minute, but I wanted to follow up on this question of the Chinese briefly. When I was ambassador like 20 years ago, Romanians, both in government and individuals in the street, had a very clear view of Russia. They didn't like them and they were afraid of them. China was much less visible and much less of a player 20 years ago when I was there. What is the attitude of Romanians, the ordinary people, and the political class towards the Chinese? Is it similar to the attitude to the Russians or different?
That's a good question. Yes and no. It's similar in some respects. It's different in others. I think the Russians are generally, I'm not sure they're feared anymore. They're just generally disliked. They've invaded Romania 15 times, 20 times. I'm not sure how many times. So most Romanians have little or no affinity for the Russians. The Chinese, on the other hand, have taken a different approach, a propaganda approach to try to bring businesses in. I think the PSD party, which is the remnants of the former Communist Party, have a greater affinity with them. As an example, they're the only political party in Romania that signed the birthday ledger of the Chinese Communist Party last year. So that should give you some indication of that relationship. I think they have hopes of God knows what. I don't think a lot of people in Romania realize the dangers that the Chinese pose to the economy, to the infrastructure, to human rights. The Chinese in Romania, like elsewhere in the world, dump their products here at way below cost. And they will do anything to try to infiltrate a variety of businesses, technological, as well as infrastructure type businesses, construction, with below cost arrangements to try to get control of an influence in this area. And it's just a very, very dangerous situation where I believe we have to stand up and say no, which we did under the Trump administration. I think Keith Kroc and his policies and the president's policies, which he advanced for clean networks and clean pathways, was very efficient. And I hope we continue to stand up and say no to this constant Chinese push to expand everywhere, not just Romania.
Thank you. Now, Ambassador Foley's question. Is the Exxon Mobil offshore gas development deal totally off, or can it be revived?
ask the ambassador what deal is being referred to, because Romania has a very rich offshore oil and gas supply. There's one smaller field which is coming online this August, September, October, depending on production. It's run by a Carlyle-backed consortium. It's called BSOG, which stands for Black Sea Oil and Gas, and they've done a tremendous job. The Exxon field, which is called Neptune Deep, is a much larger field. Exxon has had issues there and has been seeking to divest and sell its interest there for the last couple of years or so, 2-3 years. There were a variety of unfriendly legislation passed. Some was changed. There's still a couple of issues regarding tax and use, which remain to be changed and should be changed at some point during this year. But as I understand it, Exxon is still seeking a buyer. There have been offers from various people. The government of Romania may be looking at that, but that's just speculation. So if the question was, is Exxon still seeking to divest of its interests here? I believe the answer to that is yes. I'm not involved directly in any of those discussions. Is that still yes? I don't know, and I don't know who the potential buyer is, but I can tell you this, there was last year, there was interest by Lukoil, which is the Russian gas and oil company, and the Romanians, because Exxon was intransigent, the Romanians passed a law barring an emergency law, barring Lukoil from buying into this thing, so buying Exxon's interest, an emergency regulation. So that's where we are in essence.
Gotcha. It sounds like it's not alive, but it's not dead.
Well, I think there's a deal cooking. Let's put it that way.
I understand. No, I understand. Thank you. We got another question, this time from Governor and Ambassador James Gilmore. When I arrived in Vienna at the OSCE, the first friendly contact was a Romanian ambassador to the OSCE. We became good friends. My question, what is the level of concern of Romania as to the Russian presence in Moldova and their troops supporting the breakaway region of Transnistria?
As always, Jim has a great insight into all of these things, and I want to thank him for his great work representing the United States at the OSCE. And he and I collaborated on a couple of issues. I wish we would have done more together. I think Moldova causes a great degree of concern for Romania. Romania has tried to support Moldova and the rule of law and the democratic process in Moldova as much as it could. There's a new West-leaning prime minister over there after elections last year, which is a great relief for Romania. The Russian troops in Transnistria, Jim, the Russians say they're just old guards guarding some antiquated rifles from the Second World War, which I frankly don't believe for a second. I think the troops are there to create the political pressure on the people of Moldova and to try to get a more friendly government to the Russians there. I think Moldova, like Crimea, which is a big problem now for Europe, and frankly for the rest of the world, could be a tremendous problem. Half the population, or a little less than half now, because many Romanian people have emigrated, but about half the population in Moldova is Romanian, and they all have Romanian passports. The other half is of Russian ethnicity, and it's a problem for Romania. Most of Moldova was part of Romania prior to the Second World War. In Crimea, as I mentioned, it's tantamount to having, and too bad we can't hear Harry live on this, because he would give us some great insight from the military strategic point of view. But Crimea is like a land aircraft carrier. It's a peninsula that sticks out into the Black Sea. Prior to the Russians taking over Crimea a number of years ago, the Russian fleet in the Black Sea was a rusting hulk of stuff. Right now, the Russian Black Sea fleet is comprised of state-of-the-art ships. They have regular exercises where they declare vast areas of the Black Sea off limits for commercial traffic. And they're basically wreaking havoc and trying to intimidate the Romanians, the Ukrainians, and all the other countries bordering the Black Sea. And if you look at it strategically, from Romania and from the Ukraine, you can control the Middle East. You have missiles that reach Europe. You can go in a lot of areas within 1,500, 2,000 miles without too much trouble. So it's a very strategic position that the Russians managed to get and maintain. And it's a very, very big problem and source of concern for the Europeans and the Romanians.
Let me follow up on that, mentioning Ukraine. Ukraine is obviously a neighbor of Romania. It obviously is not in NATO or the European Union. It obviously was part of the former Soviet Union. As you just pointed out, it's where Russian troops on the eastern side and in Crimea are located today. And as recently in the last month or so, it's been a flashpoint in terms of conflict. How does that look from Romania? How do they look at Ukraine? How do they look at the Ukrainians? What are their relationships with them? Where do they see Ukraine going from their point of view?
That's a complicated question, and I'm not sure there's a simple answer. I think they're more concerned about the Ukraine and Moldova as a consequence of Ukraine than others in Europe, because obviously they're much closer to it. And Moldova is a key component of that, but so is the state of the Ukraine. And I think one of the important lessons for us to learn there is that when we support our allies like Ukraine and provide them with assistance, real military assistance and real help, other allies will stand up and follow our lead with respect to other issues. When we equivocate, when we do not show leadership, when we are weak, we do not follow through on promises we made, it doesn't just affect the insular country. It affects a lot of our other allies, like Romania, like Poland, like other countries, which have to make a variety of decisions, and they have to say, look, they said the same thing to us. Can we take that to the bank or not? So it is a very, very important strategic decision-making process of how the United States deals with these issues, not just for Ukraine, but for a lot of our other European allies, because these things are not just one-offs. It's a much bigger picture. So I'm not sure that answered your question exactly, but it's a problem. I can't put it better than that. And it's a fluid and dynamic problem, which grew to a boiling point. The U.S. decided not to put in ships into the Black Sea a couple of months ago. People took notice of that. A lot of people took notice of that. So was it the right decision or the wrong decision? Not for me to say, but people took notice of our absence. Now, we just had a big NATO exercise in Romania, which I think was very effective to send a message. And I think it's very important that messages of strength and unity are delivered consistently with the same voice by the United States and all of its European allies.
What I hear you saying is that the negotiation relationship of the United States with one nation affects the relationship with other nations, because everybody looks at everybody. So I can see why your background in real estate negotiation is very helpful in this job, because it sounds a lot like real estate negotiation as well.
It's all widgets.
I understand. I'm gonna wrap up with one last question. What is the one or two most interesting things you learned during your term as ambassador about yourself, about America, about Romania, foreign policy, whatever it is? What was the most interesting thing you learned during your time there?
I learned a number of things. I hope I learned. I always tell my daughter, make sure you learn something new every day. So I try to do the same thing, but it was a unique experience being given the opportunity to represent our great country in Romania. And I will always be grateful to President Trump for giving me that opportunity. I think that I found out how great the United States is. One of the things that truly amazed me is getting a list of funds that come into Romania from the United States, from agencies I had never even heard of before, and from private sources. It's an enormous sum of money that most people don't hear about. And the same type of funding goes into virtually every other country around the world. So what really impressed me is how great the United States is, how charitable we are, how concerned we are about other countries. And I hope that we can continue that and move that forward. The other thing that truly impressed me is how well I've been received by the Romanian people, not just the government people, which many of them have become close personal friends, but just ordinary people. And it was very rewarding and emotional experience for me to have that. So I also think, my last thought on this,
Sure.
I think, and one of the things perhaps I can ask all of you to take back home or discuss with your friends and others, very few Americans on a percentage basis have been overseas to visit places like Romania, like Poland, like any other country. The most you get is people going to Italy or France or something like that on a week's vacation. But go to Africa, go abroad, see what these places are like. and then you realize how great the United States is and what we should be doing to continue the efforts to keep the United States great. Because if it was not for the United States, most of these countries around the world would be without any hope. And I think it's important that we understand and remember that. So that's what I got.
I think on that note, it's a wonderful upbeat message that I think many of us who have represented our country in many different countries in the world can identify with. Adrian, thanks for joining us today. And thanks to everybody for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Jim.